Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel The Nature and the Wild. So today we are going to dive in to very important topic, autofocus points and autofocus zone. Whether you are a sports photographer, you are a portrait photographer, or you are an action photographer, or you are a wildlife photographer, to understand these settings will take your photography to a different level. By the end of this video, you will be aware and you will know what is one-shot autofocus, what is servo autofocus, and what are the different autofocus zones we should use during the wildlife photography or action photography, and what are the different scenarios. So let's get started. So guys, the first autofocus point we must use is the one-shot autofocus, useful for your still images. So that means if your subject is not moving and it's not very dynamic, it's just sitting in one place, you can use this autofocus point. You just pick up your camera, point it to your subject, and just autofocus will locked. This kind of autofocus is very much useful for still photography, portrait photography, but do not use it for the dynamic subject. Why? Because for the dynamic subjects which are moving too much, like in the action photography or sports photography, or we talk about the wildlife photography, we must use the servo autofocus, where we should be able to track the subject. The autofocus should be able to track the subject and lock on it, so you will not miss your focus. So if you are a wildlife photographer, sports photographer, please use the servo autofocus so not to miss your focus points.
So guys, one more good example of it. So you can see how quickly it grabbed the subject. I move my camera towards anything else, and as much as I've come back to the subject, initial subject is still tracking, because in my Canon R7 what I did, I put my tracking sensitivity is locked on, so it's keep logging on the subject, and the dynamic acceleration is also to the locked on.
So here is the time for a pro tip. On your camera, you have two buttons. One is your back button, which is a back button autofocus, and one autofocus button is your shutter button. So I will always recommend it to use the back button as an autofocus. Why? Because every time you press your shutter button, the camera is going to readjust its focus. So that means your subject is sitting there, you locked your focus, the subject moved somewhere else, you have to move your camera and press the button again, half press, and then the camera will take longer time to adjust the focus points. But if you use your back button autofocus, you just lock the focus one time, and it doesn't matter where the subject is gone. Every time the subject enters in your focus area, the autofocus will be automatically locked on your subject. And it's a pretty good habit or pretty good behavior if you can practice that. So that brings us to the next pointer. Okay. We know about the autofocus points. Now what about the autofocus zone? Most of the time I take pictures and then I see the bird is blurred, or it's not sharp, or the image is not what I exactly wanted. So in that scenario, we must work on our autofocus zones. So on the Canon cameras or any cameras, we have different type of autofocus zones. So the first is the spot autofocus. Spot autofocus means, as the name says, spot. So that means your subject is somewhere and you have to pinpoint the autofocus onto your subject. There is nothing else. It's all about the subject. You pick up your camera, you aim it to the subject and press your shutter button, and the subject is locked. That is a spot auto. So it is very much useful if you are doing a macro photography, or you are doing a still photography, or you are doing portrait shot. So the spot autofocus is really important at that point. So guys, the next autofocus point is the expand area autofocus. So expand area means it will give you little bit more room for the subject to move slightly, not too much erratic movement, but slightly. So if your subject is not moving too much and it is still in the frame, use the expand area autofocus to make sure your subject, the autofocus gets locked on your subject. It is very good for the sports and also little bit for the bird photography if you know that your subject is not very erratic or doesn't have a lot of dynamic movement. On the Canon cameras or other cameras, you also have some zones like one vertical zone, horizontal zone, you know. So what are those things? So that means the zone autofocus is going to expand a little bit more if you know your subject is moving horizontally up and down, you know. So you can use a horizontal autofocus zone, and that will keep tracking your subject whether it's move up or move it down, and it is very much easy to track the subject during this kind of space. And the same way, the zone 2 is a vertical zone. That means where you know that your subject is under these vertical lines or vertical boundaries, and it will keep tracking the subject under this focus area, autofocus zone area. So this is pretty much good if you know your bird is not moving too much, but it's take a small flight and goes for a shorter distance, you know. Then you should use the zone 2 vertical or horizontal. But there is another one, what is called whole area autofocus zone, and that is pretty much useful, and I use 99% time when I am taking a action photograph, like a bird is flying and I want to take it sharp and pinpoint, because nowadays the cameras are mirrorless camera. It has AI tracking, it has animal tracking, eye tracking, blah blah blah, lot of stuff in it, and the camera is very intelligent to understand what my subject is and where my subject is in the camera viewfinder. So if you use little bit more area or whole area autofocus zone, you have the enough space, and you will not miss a single chance to lock the focus onto the subject. And for that, you need to make sure your camera has some checkpoints are ticked. Like the first one, you need to make sure your camera has a tracking enabled, and that tracking should be eye tracking, and also the subject should be animal. If you're shooting birds or shooting any animal, or you're shooting sports, then you have to check box the vehicle or car or whatever you have on your camera. You have to check that settings, but the point is, make sure your tracking is enabled onto the right subject. Now you have to adjust your tracking sensitivity. So you need to make sure your tracking sensitivity is properly adjusted and locked on the subject. It can track the subject if it moves right, left, or it's flying, whatever. Second thing, once your tracking is enabled, then you need to go to your camera's little bit advanced settings. Like in the Canon R7, I have a couple of cases to define what kind of subject or how my autofocus will react if I found this kind of subject. So I always use like case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, but you can customize those cases. So for me, like I have a case 1 which I adjusted according to the autofocus, you know, and I keep it the tracking sensitivity little bit +1. That means it's higher. It will keep tracking my subject. If the subject move out of my focus area and come back, it will start tracking the animal quickly. And also I put my tracking sensitivity for the dynamic subject, like small birds, they move too much, you know, and that is very difficult to keep a track of it. So I make sure my autofocus also responds with the bird's movement. So this kind of settings you really need to do on your camera before you are going to use any kind of autofocus setup. So guys, I hope this gives you a really good idea now what kind of photography you are going to do and what kind of autofocus points and autofocus zone you should use according to your scene. So guys, at the last, I'm putting these different scenarios on the screen for you. You can have a read to them and you can understand what kind of scenarios and what kind of autofocus setup you can use during your wildlife journey. I hope this will help you. So please put your comments in the question box and I will try to get back to you, and hope you like this video today. Please like, share and subscribe my channel, The Nature and the Wild. See you in the next episode.